The sound of shattering glass wasn't just the storm finally breaking our living room window, it was the start of a nightmare I never could have imagined. I am Caleb Monroe, 45, and that morning I stood frozen in the wreckage of my home in the Florida Panhandle. The water was waist-deep, filthy, and thick with debris. But the horror wasn't the flood, it was the massive silhouette pacing through our kitchen. It was a lion. A mountain lion, easily 150 pounds of raw power and fury right there in my house. My wife, Eva, was paralyzed with fear behind me. We held our breath, expecting to be attacked. Yet the creature wasn't focused on us. In its jaws, it was dragging a heavy, soaking wet grey sack. It didn't look like food. It looked like it was desperate to keep whatever was inside safe from the rising water. The beast dropped the wet bundle onto our dining table with a heavy thud, then turned its yellow eyes directly toward us, unleashing a low, bone-chilling growl that shook the very foundation of the house. We were trapped with a wild apex predator in our living room, and what we found inside that bag moments later changed everything. Before we get into the details of this shocking encounter, tell me in the comments what time is it where you are watching this and what city are you in. I want to know just how far this wild tale has traveled. If you are as stunned by this twist as I was, type survived in the comments too. Show your support for this incredible lion. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more unbelievable wildlife rescue stories. Walking through the wreckage of our home, the silence was louder than the roaring winds had ever been. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that clung to the air, broken only by the rhythmic, mournful drip of water from the ceiling onto the saturated carpet. Eva stood beside me, her knuckles white as she gripped a shattered piece of the doorframe, surveying the devastation that was once our living room. Every piece of furniture was either overturned, broken, or submerged under 6 inches of brownish, stagnant mud that smelled of pine needles, broken earth, and sewage. The storm had not just visited us, it had moved in, destroyed, and left behind this somber devastation. I looked at the overturned sofa, its cushions floating in the murky water, and realized that our sense of security had been washed away just as violently as our worldly possessions. Eva finally found her voice, a shaky whisper that barely carried in the oppressive quiet. "Caleb, we have to see how bad the kitchen is." I nodded, navigating through the debris field that used to be a cozy entryway. The kitchen was worse. The refrigerator had tipped over, spilling its contents across the floor, mixing frozen food with mud and debris. Cabinet doors hung precariously by single hinges, and the pantry was a sludge-covered ruin. We moved toward the back of the house, toward the master bedroom, our steps echoing, unsettlingly loud in the house that no longer held its usual warmth. The structural damage was severe. The ceiling sagged in several places, and I could hear the slow, agonizing creak of timber straining under the weight of the water. Eva stopped abruptly, pulling me back with a hand that was trembling uncontrollably. She pointed toward the doorway, leading to the utility room, where the mud was thicker and the scent of the wild was overpowering. "Look," she breathed, her voice trembling. There, embedded in the thick mud on the floorboards, was a massive, terrifyingly distinct paw print. It was too big for a dog, too wide for a coyote. It was the print of the apex predator that was currently sitting in our living room. My blood ran cold as I followed the trail of smaller, blood-streaked paw prints that led away from the utility door across the kitchen floor and directly into the living room, disappearing into the shadows, where Thor was now likely resting. We stood, paralyzed, the reality of our situation sinking in with crushing weight. It wasn't just that a mountain lion had entered our home to escape the flood. It was that we were trapped in the wreckage with a creature that could kill us instantly, and it was wounded. The blood trail was thin but persistent, a stark red line against the dull grey of the mud, leading us not to a threat, but to a mystery. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was tense, waiting, filled with the potential for violence or mercy. I couldn't tell which. We didn't speak. The need to understand what this predator was doing here outweighed the immediate terror of its presence. I slowly moved closer to the utility room, trying to avoid stepping directly into the mud to see if I could find where the beast had entered. The heavy exterior door was smashed inward, the sturdy lock torn right out of the frame as if it were made of cardboard. There were claw marks deep into the wood, evidence of a desperate, panicked entry. The mountain lion had been just as scared of the storm as we were, driven by an instinct far stronger than its fear of humans. I turned back to Eva, who was watching the trail intently, her fear momentarily replaced by a deep curiosity. "It's injured," I noted, quietly pointing to a concentrated smear of blood near the shattered doorframe, suggesting the animal had stopped there to catch its breath. The trail continued into the darkness of our home, a silent guide to the confrontation that was waiting for us. We had to move carefully, not just because of the debris and the threat of the roof collapsing, but because we were now sharing our broken home with a predator that was likely protecting something. The blood was a testament to pain, and pain in a wild animal often meant desperation. We were no longer just survivors of a hurricane. We were witnesses to a desperate struggle for survival unfolding in the ruined heart of our own sanctuary. And the silent storm of the aftermath was only just beginning to reveal its secrets. The trail leading directly to the living room was a path we had to follow, but it was also a path that could lead to our deaths, making every step a gamble against the raw, untamed forces of nature that had invaded our lives and refused to leave. The sheer power required to break through a reinforced steel door made my heart pound against my ribs, a stark reminder of the danger lurking just feet away. I grabbed a heavy iron fireplace poker from the corner, the only weapon I could find, but it felt agonizingly light against the power of the beast I knew was just around the corner. Eva gripped my arm, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and an inexplicable urge to understand. The blood was now mixing with the water, creating a surreal crimson tapestry across our flooded floor, a visual representation of the violent intersection of our lives and the wild. I tried to mentally map the interior of the house, calculating how long it would take us to reach the back exit if we were charged. Every creak of the house, every drop of water falling from the ceiling was amplified, turning the simple act of walking into a terrifying minefield. The mud seemed to suck at our boots, slowing our movements and magnifying our vulnerability. I looked at Eva, trying to convey a sense of calm. I certainly didn't feel my jaw set tight as I pushed forward. The air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. This was not just a cleanup. It was a confrontation with the raw, untamed reality of Florida's wilderness, a reality that had breached our defenses and was now demanding our full attention, regardless of the cost. As the fog lifted over the Florida panhandle, the true scale of destruction was revealed, bringing a terrifying new problem with it. A distant rhythmic thumping began to pulse through the damp morning air, vibrating against the shattered window frame I was nervously monitoring. It was the sound of a helicopter, a low-frequency vibration that signaled the arrival of search and rescue teams. But as the blades chopped through the thick grey mist, I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach. The helicopter wasn't circling the neighborhood looking for trapped residents. It was hovering over the dense pine forest, a mile to the west, where Victor Stone's infamous unregulated exotic park was located. Eva moved to stand beside me, her eyes tracking the movement of the aircraft, her expression a mix of hope and paralyzing fear. We had heard the rumors for years about Stone, about the overcrowded cages, the lack of proper permits, and the dangerous animals he kept in substandard conditions. But we never imagined those rumors would literally break down our door. "Caleb, you don't think they're looking for him?" she whispered, nodding toward the living room where Thor was presumably still lying beside the grey sack. I didn't answer immediately. I was too busy calculating the implications. If Victor Stone was involved, this wasn't just a simple case of a displaced animal searching for shelter. It was a criminal liability, a public safety catastrophe waiting to happen. The thumping sound grew louder, then faded as the helicopter moved further away, leaving us in a tense, expectant silence that felt heavier than before. The news radio I managed to crank on for a few seconds confirmed our fears, reporting that several high-risk animals had escaped from a private compound following the structural failure of their enclosures during the storm. The broadcaster's voice was crisp and clinical, talking about public safety alerts and hazard protocols. But to us, it meant the beast in our room was a target, and we were effectively holding it hostage. My mind raced through the details I knew about Stone, a man known more for his quick temper and willingness to cut corners than his dedication to animal welfare. If Thor was his and Thor was known to be dangerous, the authorities would not be coming with tranquilizers, they would be coming with heavy firepower. Eva clutched my arm, her breath catching in her throat as a new sound emerged from the living room. Not a growl, but a long, low whine like a distressed puppy, followed by the soft rustling of the burlap sack. The lion was not just injured, it was anxious, and the tension in the house was ratcheting up to an unbearable level. We had to make a decision, and we had to make it quickly before the search teams tracked the paw prints and blood trail to our doorstep. The threat wasn't just the lion. It was the entire situation, a perfect storm of desperation, crime, and wild nature colliding in our flooded kitchen. I realized then that protecting the lion was no longer just about empathy. It was about preventing a tragedy, about ensuring that Thor and whatever was in that bag didn't become victims of Victor Stone's negligence. The helicopter returned closer this time, its searchlight sweeping across the tops of the trees, a beacon of authority that felt like an impending threat to the secret we were now harboring. The air felt thick, charged with the fear of discovery, and I knew that every passing minute was bringing us closer to a confrontation we were completely unprepared for. The sound of the blades seemed to vibrate inside my own skull, a constant reminder of the external world rapidly closing in on our isolated, broken world. Eva was looking at me with a desperate intensity, waiting for a plan, but my mind was spinning, trying to reconcile the terror of the lion's presence with the terrifying reality of what Victor Stone represented. We were caught between the wild and the ruthless, and the only path forward was one that could easily lead to our destruction. The silence that followed the helicopter's departure this time felt less like a pause and more like a breath held before a scream. A precarious moment where the tiniest action could set off a chain reaction of violence. The blood on the floor was starting to dry, a dark, ominous stain that seemed to mark our home as a place of death. Yet the faint whine from the living room continued, a stark reminder that this was also a place of desperation and perhaps unexpected tenderness. The threat beyond our door was no longer just the storm. It was the consequence of man's greed, and it was sitting in our living room, waiting. The radio continued to buzz with frantic reports, adding to the overwhelming sense of chaos. I knew if Stone arrived first, he would likely kill the animal to avoid the fines, and he wouldn't hesitate to remove any witnesses. Eva began to pace the narrow, dry hallway, her steps frantic as she checked the windows again and again. The structural damage to our home was severe, but it was nothing compared to the imminent danger posed by the search efforts. I looked at the broken iron poker I still held, realizing its uselessness against both the lion and the potential human threat. Every nerve in my body was stretched to the limit, my muscles tense and aching from the physical toll of the storm and the mental anguish of the last hour. I tried to calm my breathing, to focus on the immediate need for a plan, but the image of Stone's cold eyes, which I had only seen in local newspaper articles, kept surfacing. The stakes had just been raised from a simple rescue to a life-and-death struggle against both nature and human cruelty. We were running out of time, and the world outside was closing in, oblivious to the desperate, silent battle being fought within our walls. Part 4. A mother's desperation. Panic turned to a strange sense of empathy as we watched the beast from behind the kitchen island. The terror that had paralyzed us moments before slowly began to morph, replaced by a surreal fascination as I realized Thor's frantic energy had completely vanished. The massive lion was no longer pacing. She was slumped against the wall beneath the shattered window, her chest heaving with exhaustion, a stark contrast to the ferocity she had displayed upon entering. Blood continued to seep slowly from a deep laceration on her left shoulder, staining the muddy carpet, a dark, ominous crimson. Yet she seemed completely oblivious to her own pain. Her sole focus was the grey burlap sack she had dragged through the flooded streets, now lying only inches from her paws. Eva tightened her grip on my arm, her knuckles white, but she didn't scream or move to run. She was mesmerized, just as I was, by the profound exhaustion radiating from the predator. Thor was not resting, she was protecting. The silence in the house was broken only by her labored breathing and the occasional, almost imperceptible rustling of the sack. For a terrifyingly long minute, we watched, paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of the scene, two humans trapped in their own flooded home, sharing the space with an apex predator that was clearly acting on pure, desperate instinct. It was the smell of the wet burlap and the copper tang of blood that finally forced me to act but not to attack. I needed to see what was in that bag, what could drive a creature like this to risk entering a human dwelling. The fear of Stone's helicopter was still hanging over us, but it was now overshadowed by a primal curiosity about the life Thor was fighting for. Eva slowly loosened her grip, turning her head toward me with a look of absolute confusion and concern. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, the same realization washing over her that was washing over me. This was not a threat to us. It was a mother in crisis. I took a tentative step out from behind the safety of the kitchen island, the cold water splashing around my boots, but Thor didn't rise. She merely lifted her head, her yellow eyes tracking my movement with a tired, weary gaze that lacked the malice I had expected. She was simply too weak, too exhausted to defend herself, yet her paws stayed anchored to the sack. I stopped keeping my hands visible, making no sudden movements, trying to communicate with a language far older than words. It was in this tense standoff that the grey sack moved again, more violently this time, and a tiny, high-pitched cry erupted from within, a sound of utter distress that tore through the quiet of the room. Thor reacted instantly, not by roaring, but by letting out a low, desperate whine and gently licking the burlap as if trying to soothe whatever was inside. It was a scene of pure maternal desperation that shattered any remaining fear I had of the lion itself. The beast was not there to kill. She was there to beg for help, to find a dry, safe place for her young in a world that had literally been washed away. Eva whispered something I couldn't understand, a broken emotional phrase that was instantly drowned out by another cry from the sack. The realization hit us like a physical blow. Thor was nursing a cub, and the cub was injured just like its mother. The threat of Stone, the destruction of our home, the terror of the storm, everything seemed to fade into the background, replaced by this intense, unexpected connection with the suffering of a wild animal. I looked at Eva, and I knew we were going to help despite the overwhelming risks, despite the fact that we were dealing with a creature that could kill us with a single swipe of its paw. We were no longer victims of a natural disaster. We were participants in a desperate act of compassion unfolding in the ruined heart of our own home. I could feel the mud suctioning around my boots as I took another step forward, every muscle in my body screaming for me to run, yet my feet refused to obey. The smell of the swamp water mixed with the musky scent of the lion and the sharp metallic tang of her blood was overwhelming, making my head spin. Eva began to softly recite a prayer, her voice trembling but steady, a haunting soundtrack to the most terrifying moment of our lives. Thor's eyes never left me, but they weren't predatory. They were filled with a profound, almost human desperation, a plea that I could feel in the very marrow of my bones. She was asking for help in the only way she knew how, by trusting us not to harm her cub. I stopped again only 3 feet away, close enough to see the individual strands of her wet fur, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her exhausted body. The cub inside the bag gave another feeble cry, and Thor let out a low, mournful sound, her tail twitching in agitation. I realized the bag was likely soaked through, and the cub was probably shivering, fighting for its life against the cold and its injuries. We were witnessing a desperate struggle for survival, a raw, unfiltered example of the power of maternal love, and I knew we had to act now. Every second was precious, and the fear of discovery was fading, replaced by a desperate urgency to save the life in that bag. Minutes felt like hours, as we weighed the risk of approaching a wild animal in our own living room. The decision to intervene was not born of logic, but of a raw emotional compulsion triggered by the desperate cries of the cub from within the burlap sack. Eva and I exchanged a silent glance, a momentary communion of fear and purpose, before she began moving slowly toward the kitchen wreckage, her eyes fixed on Thor's weary, watchful gaze. The air was thick with the scent of wet fur and impending disaster, every step we took feeling like a gamble against a beast that could easily tear us apart. Eva reached the ruined pantry, her hands shaking as she dug through the mud-caked debris to find anything edible that hadn't been completely contaminated by the floodwaters. She emerged with a package of raw steak, its plastic wrapping torn a scent that immediately caused Thor's ears to twitch and her yellow eyes to lock onto the meat. It was the only leverage we had, a desperate bribe offered to an apex predator in exchange for the life of its young. I watched Thor's muscles tense, a ripple of controlled power passing through her massive frame, yet she remained seated, her intense focus divided between the food and the sack beneath her paws. Eva took a trembling breath, taking a slow step toward the living room, holding the meat out to the side, away from the cub, trying to draw Thor's attention toward the far corner. Thor let out a low rumbling sound that felt less like a threat and more like a warning. Her gaze, intense but not immediately hostile, a flicker of comprehension passing between predator and prey. I used this momentary distraction to grab a long, aluminum curtain rod that had fallen from the ceiling, its sharp end potentially serving as a tool to drag the sack without getting too close. The water was frigid, creeping up my legs as I moved carefully around the edge of the room, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, each splash sounding like a gunshot in the tense quiet. Thor's head snapped toward me, her low growl intensifying, but Eva softly called her name, a name we had subconsciously given her, and tossed the steak into the dark corner, drawing the lion's gaze away from me, just long enough. It was a terrifying dance of trust and desperation, a delicate balancing act where one wrong move could result in a fatal attack. I reached out with the rod, the cold metal trembling in my hands, hooking the edge of the heavy, soaking wet burlap sack and pulling it gently, millimeter by millimeter, toward the kitchen threshold. Thor's agitation grew, her claws scraping against the wooden floorboards, but she did not leap her instinct to eat, fighting with her instinct to protect, yet she remained in the corner with the food. The sack was heavy, waterlogged, and resisted movement, a dead weight that seemed to anchor the entire situation in a terrifying equilibrium. Eva continued to talk softly to the lion, her voice a soothing murmur that seemed to calm the beast. A surreal interaction between a human and a predator that defied all laws of nature. The tension was suffocating every muscle in my body, straining as I finally pulled the sack across the threshold and into the kitchen, away from Thor's immediate reach. The lion let out a sharp, piercing cry, her gaze locked on the sack, but she stayed by the corner, her hunger overriding her panic for just a few crucial seconds. We had achieved the impossible. We had separated the cub from the mother, but the danger was far from over, as Thor was now looking at us not with weary desperation, but with the focused intensity of a predator whose young had been taken. Eva immediately rushed to my side, grabbing the other end of the sack, and together we began dragging it toward the utility room. Our movements panicked and hurried, the adrenaline finally taking over. The scent of the lion was overpowering, the smell of mud and blood thick in the air, a constant reminder of the volatile situation we were navigating. Every second was precious, and the fear that Thor would realize her mistake and charge us was almost unbearable. A terrifying anticipation of violence that made my skin crawl. We were no longer just observers. We were active participants in a dangerous game, allies with a beast in a fight against a reality that was rapidly closing in on us. The sound of our splashing boots seemed to echo throughout the broken house, announcing our movements to the lion as we desperately worked to shield the cub from her view. I could feel Thor's gaze burning into my back, a terrifying pressure that made every instinct scream at me to run. But the image of the weak, tiny cub forced me to continue. The utility room door was just ahead, a potential sanctuary where we could finally examine the cub without the looming threat of the mother's interference. The weight of the sack was becoming unbearable, the mud and water inside adding to its already substantial bulk, forcing us to use every ounce of our strength just to move it. Eva was panting, her face flushed with exertion and fear, but she didn't let go of the sack, her determination mirroring my own. We reached the doorway, stumbling into the relative safety of the utility room, and quickly slammed the door shut, locking it with a trembling hand, effectively cutting ourselves off from the rest of the house. The quiet in the small room was sudden and absolute, broken only by the sound of our own ragged breathing and the faint, almost silent rustling coming from the sack. The burlap sack tore open, revealing a sight that brought Eva to tears and made Caleb freeze. Inside, the wet, muddy bundle lay a tiny mountain lion cub, no bigger than a house cat, its fur matted with debris and shaking uncontrollably from the cold. The air in the utility room felt instantly heavier, thick with a mix of fear and profound sorrow as we stared at the vulnerable creature. Its right hind leg was twisted at a sickening angle, clearly broken, likely crushed by falling debris when the storm destroyed its enclosure at Stone's compound. Eva fell to her knees beside the sack, her tears dripping onto the cold concrete floor, ignoring the danger that was still lurking just on the other side of the utility door. She reached out with trembling fingers to touch the cub's head, and to our shock, it didn't hiss or growl. It merely let out a weak, desperate squeak, its eyes cloudy and unfocused. I realized that the cub was in shock, its tiny body fighting a losing battle against injury and hypothermia, a raw, unfiltered example of nature's fragility. The mother's desperate cries from the kitchen were getting louder, Thor now clawing at the door, her desperation increasing as the distance between her and her young grew. I looked at the door, the wood splintering under the pressure of the powerful predator, a stark reminder that our sanctuary was only temporary. "We have to stabilize its leg, Caleb, or it won't make it," Eva whispered, her voice barely audible over the rumbling of the lion outside. I scrambled to find anything in the utility room that could serve as a splint, my hands shaking so badly I could hardly grasp the materials. The scene was surreal, two humans attempting to perform medical care on a wild animal in the middle of a flooded home, while its mother threatened to break through the walls. I finally found a sturdy piece of PVC pipe and some duct tape materials. I quickly cut into strips with a rusty pair of shears I found on a shelf. As I worked on the cub, gently straightening its tiny leg, I could feel its heart fluttering against my fingertips, a terrifyingly fast rhythm that signaled its terror and pain. Thor's claws finally broke through the top panel of the door, her yellow eye appearing in the gap, looking directly at us with a terrifying, unfocused intensity. Eva didn't freeze. She continued to whisper soothing words to the cub, her courage a beacon in the terrifying dark. I realized that if I could show Thor we were helping, she might stop her attack, a desperate gamble that could either save us or get us killed. I took a deep breath, looking directly into Thor's eye, and slowly held up the splintered leg of the cub, letting her see the care we were taking. The screeching and clawing stopped instantly, a terrifyingly sudden silence filling the room as the lion processed the scene, her predatory instinct momentarily overridden by her maternal anxiety. The eye stayed at the gap for a long, agonizing moment, then vanished, and the clawing against the door ceased, replaced by a low, mournful whimpering. It was an act It was an act of understanding, a broken bond, momentarily repaired by the recognition of shared compassion. But we knew it was only a temporary truce. The cub was still severely injured, the blood on its leg now dried and cracking, a testament to the trauma it had endured. Eva gently lifted the cub, wrapping it in a dry towel. I had found her movements tender and full of unconditional love. We had stabilized the immediate injury, but the cub needed professional veterinary care, and the threat of Victor Stone was still looming outside our broken home. The silent storm of the aftermath was only just beginning to reveal its secrets, and the fragile bond we had formed with the predators in our house was about to be tested in ways we could never have imagined. The air in the room seemed to hold its breath, the only sound being the distant thrum of a helicopter and the occasional faint whine of the lion mother from the other side of the broken door. I could feel the cold of the concrete seeping through my jeans, a numbness that matched the terrifying reality of our situation. We were not just caregivers now, we were custodians of a life that was technically owned by a dangerous criminal, making our actions legally perilous as well as physically hazardous. The cub's breaths were shallow, a reminder that every minute we waited was bringing it closer to death from shock or internal injuries we couldn't see. Eva gently rocked the cub, her eyes filled with a desperate hope, a stark contrast to the destruction surrounding us. I stood up, my legs trembling, looking for a way to secure the door better, knowing that Thor's understanding was likely temporary and driven by sheer exhaustion. The scent of fear was palpable, mixing with the musky odor of the cub and the dampness of the room, creating a suffocating atmosphere that threatened to overwhelm us. Every shadow in the room seemed to shift, bringing with it the fear of imminent violence, forcing me to remain constantly vigilant. We had created a momentary peace in the middle of a disaster, but the world outside was still violent and unforgiving, and the cub's survival was still a fragile, uncertain thing. The sound of a heavy truck crunching on broken glass interrupted our moment of mercy. I froze the makeshift splint for Pip's leg, slipping from my numb fingers as the heavy rumble of a diesel engine idling in our flooded driveway cut through the tense quiet of the utility room. Through the small, cracked window, I could see a massive, mud-splattered black pickup truck, parked aggressively blocking our exit, the engine idling like a predator waiting to strike. A man stepped out, his face contorted in a sneer, clad in expensive, rugged gear that contrasted sharply with the surrounding destruction of our Florida home. It was Victor Stone, the ruthless owner of the nearby exotic park, a man known to prioritize profit over animal life, and his presence signaled an imminent, violent end to our fragile truce with the mountain lion Thor. Eva rushed to the utility door, pressing her back against it, her eyes wide with a paralyzing terror that instantly replaced the tenderness she had shown to the cub. "He's here for them, Caleb," she whispered, her voice trembling, her hands gripping the door handle as if that tiny metal piece could protect us from the danger outside. Stone was walking toward the broken utility door, a heavy-duty shotgun slung casually over his shoulder, his boots splashing carelessly through the mud. A stark contrast to the quiet respect we had shown the land and the animals. He didn't knock. He simply reached for the handle, pushing against Eva's weight, his face appearing in the gap where Thor had previously clawed through the wood. "I know you have my cats," Monroe Stone shouted, his voice, a gravelly roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the shattered utility room. "They're dangerous, they're expensive, and I'm here to collect what's mine, one way or another." My adrenaline spiked, a raw protective instinct surging through my body, forcing me to step in front of Eva, despite the weapon pointed loosely in our direction. I knew that if I handed them over, Stone would likely kill the mother and immediately euthanize the cub, a horrific outcome I could not live with. "They are injured, Stone, and they are not yours to treat like garbage," I shouted back, my voice shaking but firm, stepping forward into the doorway, creating a barrier between him and the frightened cub behind us. Stone sneered, taking a menacing step closer, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation, a cold, calculating gaze that showed no humanity, only the desperate desire to protect his reputation and assets. He raised the shotgun slightly, a direct threat that made the air in the room feel instantly electric with the potential for violence. Eva didn't hesitate. She reached for her smartphone, which was miraculously still working, and began recording, her hands steady, despite her fear, knowing that video evidence was our only shield against his brutality. "I'm recording this, Victor," she screamed, holding the phone up, a desperate gamble that forced him to pause, the threat of legal exposure momentarily outweighing his desire for immediate violence. The standoff was suffocating. The only sound, the distant, frantic whimpering of Thor, who was still locked inside the kitchen, separated from her young by the door we were standing in. Stone's face went white with rage, his finger tightening on the trigger, a moment that felt like an eternity, a terrifying balance between life and death. Suddenly the chaotic scene was broken by the rapid, piercing sound of sirens, a frantic wail that approached our house with desperate speed, the blue and red lights flashing through the shattered windows. 2 Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission trucks roared up the driveway, blocking Stone's vehicle, officers leaping out with weapons drawn, commanding him to drop his gun. Stone's arrogance evaporated, instantly replaced by a panicked, desperate expression as he realized his empire of cruelty was finally being dismantled, his illegal actions witnessed by the police. He dropped the shotgun into the mud, his hands raised in surrender, the rage in his eyes replaced by a terrifying fear of the consequences he had ignored for so long. We stood paralyzed, watching the officers wrestle Stone to the ground, the justice we had prayed for finally arriving, but at a cost I knew would haunt us forever. The sirens continued to wail, a deafening soundtrack to the end of Stone's reign of terror, while the officers began to secure the area, their faces grim and professional. I could see the confusion and fear on Stone's face as he was handcuffed, a pathetic sight compared to the menacing figure he had been moments before the tables finally turned. Eva sank against the wall, her phone still, recording tears of relief and exhaustion streaming down her face, the weight of the last few hours finally crushing her. I reached out to hold her, my own body trembling from the sudden release of adrenaline. The fear of death replaced by a profound sense of exhaustion and disbelief. The air felt lighter, yet the smell of fear and mud still clung to us, a reminder of the violent encounter we had just survived. We had stood up to a bully, and with the help of the law we had won, but the sight of the broken utility door and the injured cub reminded us of the heavy price we had paid. The officers began to ask questions, their voices calm and methodical, bringing a sense of order to the chaos that had consumed our lives, the first step toward reclaiming our home and our peace. The rehabilitation center was the only place Pip could ever truly be safe, and Thor finally relaxed. The journey to the sanctuary was long and somber, the truck carrying the 2 mountain lions bumping over roads still treacherous from the hurricane's wake. Thor lay in her transport crate, her yellow eyes half closed, her massive form completely still, but she kept a watchful, protective gaze on the smaller crate next to her, where Pip was resting after the veterinary team had successfully set his broken leg. The scent of antiseptic and pine disinfectant filled the air, a stark contrast to the mud and blood of our kitchen, a smell that signaled the beginning of a long recovery process. Eva sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the crates, her expression a mix of profound sadness and overwhelming relief. The adrenaline of the confrontation with Stone had vanished, replaced by a quiet, contemplative exhaustion that seemed to settle deep in our bones. I drove slowly, navigating around fallen trees and power lines, the weight of the last 24 hours pressing down on me, the image of Stone's arrest still vivid in my mind. We were leaving behind the wreckage of our home, not knowing if we could ever truly reclaim it. But the thought of the two lions, safe in a professional facility, provided a small, comforting balm to our fractured nerves. The sanctuary was located on the edge of the Ocala National Forest, a sprawling, serene landscape of tall pines and crystal-clear springs, a world away from the chaotic urban sprawl where Stone had kept his animals. As we approached the gates, I could see the dedicated staff, waiting, their faces filled with a quiet compassion that immediately put me at ease. The transfer of the animals was swift and professional, a testament to their expertise and dedication to wildlife conservation. I watched as the crate containing Thor was opened, the massive cat pausing for a moment before stepping out, her gaze sweeping over the open enclosure, a flicker of something like freedom passing through her eyes. She immediately looked for Pip, her low rumble filling the air as she caught his scent, a sound that was no longer a threat but a soothing motherly reassurance. Pip, still weak, was carried to a specialized recovery area, a quiet place where he could heal without the risk of further injury or infection. I felt a surge of emotion, a sudden release of the tension I had been holding, onto tears blurring my vision as I watched the two lions begin their journey toward recovery. Eva walked over to me, taking my hand, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet afternoon air. "They belong here, Caleb, not in a cage." She was right, and the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, a profound lesson about the true nature of compassion. We had tried to save our home, but in doing so, we had learned that true strength lies not in domination but in protection and